بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Tonight is the fourth night of Muharram 1445 and we are honored to have our guest speaker Shereen Yousuf, who is a doctoral candidate in the Rhetoric, Politics and Culture program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research explores how Muslim communities in the US draw from their faith and community knowledge to make sense of the social political climate in the US and how this informs Muslim-based activism. Prior to moving to Madison, Shereen was an adjunct instructor of intercultural communication and was heavily involved in the Jafari Shia community in the Chicago area. She is currently working with the Shia Racial Justice Coalition to develop an anti-racism curriculum that specifically caters to Jafari Shia Muslim communities in the US for her doctoral dissertation, bridging together her passions for decolonial theorizing, pedagogy, and liberatory community-based practices. So we would be honored to having you to start your talk.
You guys can hear me okay, right? Good. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So assalamu alaikum. I just want to first begin by saying thank you to the organizers for putting this together and for putting together these programs, over these years. And I'm very humbled and honored that I've been invited to speak. So yeah, I guess I'm just going to go ahead and just jump right into it and kind of elaborate first off on why I chose this topic, this idea of remembrance through communal care. And part of that is because I think that there are a lot of ways that we talk about remembering, this tragedy of Karbala, which include, what we tend to do during these times of grieving, right? This coming together as community, these poetic lamentations, retelling these stories of what happened, especially the stories of what happened at the campsite prior to each person, seeking permission to go to battle. And I feel like a lot of this is, of course, designed to evoke sadness and to tell us what happened and to remember that. But for me, there's always been a level of a way of potentially thinking through and understanding how we might be able to show up for one another in the face of incredible sacrifice, a kind of sense of mutual love that tends to be explored and communicated when we tell these stories, and also the shared sense of responsibility that everyone is coming together for this one purpose, and there's this shared mutual loyalty, love, respect for one another in the face of that hardship that I think can serve as a lesson in many ways. So I'm interested in kind of exploring a little bit of that through this talk. And I'm going to begin by kind of discussing more broadly first what we mean by care, particularly against today's social political backdrop, and specifically how within that context, we've seen this emergence of self-care becoming a really big thing, and kind of segue and differentiate what self-care is from communal care, and how there are some aspects of the discussion of communal care that overlap with what our tradition teaches and espouses as well. And then inshallah, I'll end with some reflection of how enacting that communal care can allow us as a way to remember Karbala, even outside of the rituals that we engage in during these days. So yeah, so is there something?
1 second, we are testing something here.
Okay.
Okay, could you continue, please?
Of course, yeah. Okay, so I am gonna just begin by talking about the way that we understand care in today's context or today's social political backdrop. So I know from what Brother Heather has told me as well that this group is primarily comprised of graduate students, and I know I probably don't need to go into too much of an explanation of this, but a part of me wants to just a little bit, in case for people that are listening that might not be in these academic spaces, just a little, like a brief breakdown of some of the terms that I'm using. So so this might be redundant for some people, but inshallah, I just want to keep everyone on the same page. But essentially, when we're thinking about today's social political context, we think of how following this European project, this expansion of colonialism, the emergence of this new world order of nation states, and specifically this mentality, these ideologies surrounding what's called modernity. And a lot of these values that are attributed to modernity, they kind of they emerge from these ideas around what we might call liberalism. So these are ideals of like individuality and independence, democracy, this sort of like secularized notion of freedom, human rights. What tends to happen in the process of modernity, and kind of in the development of these nation states that we live in right now, right, is that these concepts become not only very prominent, and these values not only become very prominent, but they can become very normalized and naturalized. So when I talk about, freedom, if I say the word freedom, then there is this idea, this notion that it has to come from that particular lens, this very sort of Eurocentric lens. If I talk about something like, human rights, it's kind of immediately by default goes to kind of a secularized notion of what that could be and what that could mean and what it would look like to exercise that, precisely because this is what modernity has done. It's normalized and naturalized, Eurocentric paradigms in the way that we think about and value and set up values in our structures, right? So essentially, this process kind of coupled itself with the globalizing process of economic systems. Particularly capitalism came to be pretty prominent through this system, and it's a form of capitalism that very much that is heavily racialized, relies on the sort of, I think, even thinking about the emergence of like capitalism through colonialism. We know that some of the commodities that were part of the trade were slaves, right? And it wasn't just this process of just like, we acquired slaves through war, right? It was this actual going and stealing people from another land and so on and so forth. So the kind of backdrop that, at least the way that I'm approaching it and the way that I know others have as well, is that, we live against a backdrop where we talk about things like human rights, democracy, independence. These are the values that we have, that we quote unquote share, that are heavily normalized, and that in a lot of ways continue to kind of like build from this project of a very sort of like globalized, dependent on a form of capitalism that can be basically very racist. So the other thing that I want to clarify too, before getting more into this, is to say that I think there are folks that have sometimes conflated the terms neoliberalism with capitalism. And from my understanding, the term neoliberalism more so gets at how this sort of economic structure that we have, that we call capitalism, that's highly individualized, that doesn't really have a lot of that doesn't have a lot of control or regulation over it. It's about taking that sort of logic and mapping it onto sort of other spheres of our lives. So, if I'm not capitalizing on every single moment of my life, then, I'm not really profiting from it. And, then it's like a waste. So it's kind of this like logic, this marketized logic that's being applied to other zones and other spheres. And I bring that up because that backdrop, if we understand like a normalized value system that's hyper independent, hyper individualized, that builds from a racialized capitalist backdrop system, then this also informs the way that we might think of care and how doing work for caring for one another might look like, right? So in particular, I was going to reference Dylan Rodriguez and Ruth Gilmore, who offer this explanation of the nonprofit industrial complex. And essentially their argument is that when we think about care work and we think about, like, if I wanted to support someone or some individual, some group of people, I might go to a nonprofit organization. I might go to, an NGO of some kind, right? So their argument is kind of talking about how these nonprofit organizations still sort of operate within this system. And the idea behind the nonprofit industrial complex is that because of the sort of, and these are US based scholars, by the way, so I want to point that out as well. But because of the sort of backdrop that we have of this like neoliberal way of thinking that, the government cannot be part of our personal lives, they shouldn't be, governing these things, etc. Essentially, what that means is that the government is not taking responsibility for certain social services, right? Because that would require them to be part of our lives. So what we see is that with the rise of, neoliberal thinking, that nonprofit organizations sort of like sweep in as a way to fill that void of what the government is not doing. And what these organizations do essentially offer services that perhaps the government should be offering, but they do it in a way that's still very much at the service of the system and of that neoliberal thinking, right? So in order for nonprofit organizations to do well and to thrive, they still have to, essentially play the game, and they still have to be able to make themselves appealing and draw from these specific value systems in order to receive funding, in order to be seen legible, legitimate, and to receive support of any kind. So just to offer like a quick example of what that might look like in today's context is that, there are some organizations, nonprofit organizations, and there are global ones too. And if we have time, inshallah, we can talk about that more. But I just wanted to offer this one, and I mainly focus on the US context. So, but yeah, there's, nonprofit organizations that have become really commonplace in the US that are really interested in helping, for example, at-risk youth in, certain neighborhoods. And their model for helping young people who live in some, dangerous neighborhoods or impoverished neighborhoods is to, offer them, to kind of sweep in and offer them services like job training, or maybe develop like relationships with, law enforcement agencies. Like these are communities that are, that are dealing with poverty, that are dealing with what's called food deserts, lack of access to healthy, nutrition foods options. We have like, again, over policing that's happening in a lot of these communities. So, and of course, like basic infrastructure, there's not a lot of funding in education, et cetera, right? So the nonprofit organizations that tend to come into these spaces and try to help uplift these young people do so by having them become more part of the system, become friends with the police officers, or develop those skills as a worker, right? Try not to fall into these like bad habits. And what essentially that is that rather than putting in effort, resources, energy into like alleviating poverty, right? Or offering healthy nutritional food options, or dealing with sort of like ecological issues that are occurring in those areas, or like helping with infrastructure, education, rather than restructure everything, the organization can kind of just come in, push this idea that like these youth are so resilient, we're developing resilient youth. We're helping these at-risk kids to kind of uplift themselves. So it's an organization that comes in and allows, the society and the structure to stay as it is. And another like really quick example that I'll offer, just because I know that there are grad students that are listening in on this. I know that for me, when I started grad school, one of the first things that we were told was that, this is it's a good program because we offer 20 free sessions with the university mental health services, because being a grad student is really difficult. And it can be really hard and taxing. So here's our generous offer, is that, you know, we will offer these services and you don't have to pay for it. But again, if we think about it, you know, what are the conditions that cause a lot of graduate students to be stressed out in the first place? A lot of it has to do with maybe like not being paid properly or being overworked or being exploited in some way. And it's interesting because clearly the university has funding, it has the money, because that's how they're offering us these, you know, 20 free services with a mental health professional. But it's a lot easier to just put it on the individual to take care of themselves than it is to, again, restructure the system, right? It would be a lot, rather than trying to offer us, you know, less workload or higher pay, it's a really easy band-aid to just kind of put it there and say that you have to take care of yourself. And so this is kind of the segue into how I think the prominence of today's backdrop and today's social political backdrop is very much informed by this notion of self-care, that, you know, this world that we're living in is so bad sometimes, and it's so hard, and we're all in this rat race together, but you have to make sure to take out time for self-care. You have to take days for rest. You have to do A, B, and C for yourself, right? So as a response to this notion of self-care, there have been, you know, folks that have, and this idea of communal care has been around for a while, but the idea behind a concept like communal care is to kind of speak back to this idea of self-care and saying that, you know, sometimes the issue is not just the self. It's not just, I'm not taking a break, right? It's the point here is that we actually, as human beings, as individuals, as people that are part of community and societies, we actually need to have systems of support. And so, for example, you know, you can't self-care your way out of poverty. You can't self-care your way out of an abusive situation. You can't self-care, right? These are things where you actually need the community to come together. You need support and you need systems to be able to get through things. And so there's a lot of examples for communal care that are brought up. It can be anything as big as like, I'm protesting, you know, alongside these individuals that are experiencing oppression, or it can be something just as simple as interpersonal acts of kindness, reaching out to people that you know might be struggling, checking in with them. You know, like, I know this person is struggling financially, let me go buy them some groceries. Or I know that this family is struggling and they have a lot of kids, let me go babysit, you know? And the idea too is that, like, if I have something that I'm able to offer, for example, I'm a student, and, you know, maybe a service that I could offer is tutoring, but there might be someone else in the community that's a lawyer. And so, whereas I might be able to help this one person with the things that I am, you know, trained in, I can also expect that reciprocity, that other person would show up for me if and when I need it. And so I think another important dimension too that comes up in conversations around communal care is that we want to be able to do it in a way that people aren't asking for it, because it can be humiliating sometimes to be in a situation where you feel like you lack resources. And again, we live in a society that does make you feel sometimes insufficient if you are asking for help, because we're supposed to be hyper independent. So, you know, looking at these things, it's kind of clear that communal care aligns more with Islam, more with what our tradition teaches, more than self-care does. In that it's not just like this, like hair is not just something that is an individual duty, or it's not, I'm sorry, self-care is, it's not like individualistic, right? Communal care, or within the Islamic tradition, we have a sense of like, it is our responsibility to show up and care for one another. It is our duty to do so. It is our duty to extend that support. And there are several examples I know I can reference, but I'm just going to stick with two of them right now, two or three, just because of just for sake of time. But, you know, one of these examples is just on a basic level, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam established the masjid, the center, the masjid was meant to be a space of that sort of communal care, that communal support. People were invited to be part of the community and bring in, whatever their talents were into that space and offer that, and recognize that that was a space where you could turn to if you were struggling, if you were, feeling deprived of something in some way, that you could go to the center and you can find somebody that could offer you help. And so essentially the mosque offered services to people. And so we see how that sort of aligns with communal care. And also this, it's a very well-known, well-cited ayat whenever we talk about social justice. Surah Hadid, verse 25, I'm just going to read the translation, or the beginning portion of that translation, where it says, certainly we sent down our apostles with manifest proofs, and we sent down with them the book and the balance, so that mankind may maintain justice. And it's an important ayat because, there's reference here to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had brought prophets and had brought these books, but they were meant to be a source of guidance. They were meant to be a source of examples, but that the process and the actualizing of justice is the responsibility that falls on us, the followers of the prophets. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? There's, before I go too deep into this, I just have to give credit to part of my dissertation. I've been interviewing people in the community, talking about issues around social justice. And I am so grateful and humbled by the conversations that I've been able to have, because I think that those one-on-one conversations and those relationships have really helped me to be able to articulate a lot of these things. So I want to take a minute to put that out there. But that includes this point right here where, I've had conversations about how justice is something that we really have to understand is something that can't be imposed. I can come up with a system and I can claim that it's just, but we will never see a just society unless everyone chooses to actually participate in that justice, and everybody intentionally wants that, right? It is inherently a mutual process, and so, one more example that I'll bring in too is in Surah Asr. Again, I'll read the translation. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, by the passage of time, indeed man is in loss, except for those who have faith, do good, and urge each other to truth, and urge each other to perseverance. And so the emphasis here in this ayah, in this, especially in that last ayah, this idea that, again, there's this, except for those who have faith, who do good, and urge each other to truth, and urge each other to perseverance. This idea of mutually caring for one another, mutually searching for that truth, mutually being patient with one another. These are clearly very important ideals that are espoused in the Quran. And we see that, lived by example by the Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and, members of the Ahl Bayt, of course. And like I said, there's so many examples. Of course, there's examples of Imam Ali Alayhi Salam's governance. There's the fourth Imams, Rasalat al-Hukuk. There is a lot out there. But to kind of come to a close in terms of this particular discussion, I wanted to draw connections to Karbala specifically, because the examples of communal care that I've been bringing up have been, I feel like they've been more like material, like even the discussion of communal care, is about like these material conditions that certain people are deprived of, how we should step up to help each other in these very material ways. But I think, like I said, for me, the stories of Imam Hussein alayhi salam and the caravan, the 72 followers, like I feel like there was always a sense of this is like a little community on its own, and they show up to care for one another in ways that could serve as an example, right? And how we could show up for one another in times of sacrifice. And it's precisely because they were challenging the state or the authority of the time, that they were actually denied very basic human needs. But they still managed to show up as a community for one another. And I think the examples of this are just essentially at its core that there was this mutual understanding and commitment that what they were doing, why they were there, was to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're like, not even prayer obviously was sacrificed in the process of during battle itself, right? It was always that mutual love and that mutual devotion that facilitated and allowed for that support. And I think even about the stories of how each person again sought permission from their imam, alayhi salam, and didn't move forward unless they had that permission. So it's a very natural human thing to want to stop yourself or stop your children or your nephews, right, from going into battle, from being harmed. But in a way, like, this idea that they all understood that was what needed to happen in that circumstance. And the way that they respected one another for that. Like, in particular for me, the story that I feel is really striking is when Hazrat Qasim salam approaches Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and Imam Hussein alayhi salam feels, like disheartened. He feels like sad by the idea of someone whom he loves, and that reminds him of his brother, from being able to go into battle. And it was when Hazrat Qasim approached him and relayed that Imam Hassan alayhi salam had requested that Hazrat Qasim be there for the purposes of offering that sacrifice, that Imam Hussein alayhi salam had to allow for it, because that's their understanding of one another, of one another's responsibilities, one another's rights, in relation to their children and in relation to their family. So I think there is a lot to be said about what Karbala has taught us. And I'm going to, I know I'm short on time, but I do want to bring up this one quick example as well, because it's not totally related to communal care, but I do think that there is some resonances with today's context to bring up Sayyida Zainab Salamu Alayha, her speech to the people of Kufa, and specifically this topic of accountability and what it means to hold ourselves accountable to a higher standard. Because in this speech, she condemns the people of Kufa, she calls them out. In a lot of ways, it's recognizing, and even, this is what Imam Hussein alayhi salam heard too. This is what we tell in our majalis, that, the people of Kufa, verily their hearts are with you, but their swords are against you. That they have that understanding, but they were fearful. They didn't know how to exercise it. And it had reached such a dire point, such a point of complicity in these unjust norms, that something this tragic had to happen, right? And precisely because it reached that point, Sayyida Zainab Salamu Alayha, calling them out, I think it was a part of that makes me think about today's context, in the sense that, just to kind of reflect on how we might be complicit as well, and how abiding by norms just because they're norms, if they're unjust, how that can lead to down the line greater problems. So for me, it was this just mutual understanding of shared responsibility and duty to their Imam alayhi salam and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that sort of encompassed, this communal care in Karbala. So I'm just going to end with this comment that I think some of the lessons for us, and to be clear, this includes myself, like as I'm reading all of this and thinking through all of it, I know that I myself struggle a lot with this, that, I struggle to be in a situation where I wish I had the capacity to help more because I struggle with the capacity for just my own self, you know, because that's what the system has sort of designed and made it that way. But you know, the advice, and I feel like some things that are being derived from the lessons of Karbala is that when we show up for one another, understanding that it's actually a responsibility, it's a duty of ours to do so. So in one way or another, we have to find a way to prioritize it, and it's a responsibility that we owe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is our main focus, and of course, doing so in a way that is also serving the Imam of our time, Imam similar to the ways that the examples before us sought the advice and sought the leadership of the Imams of their time, their leadership. And most importantly, I think that there's a lot of proof in the story of Karbala, how even just like a small community of people, right? 72 people that were on the sands of Karbala. They had the mutual trust, loyalty, sincerity that they had in their intentions offered such remarkable results that it gives us a lesson too, to say that communities don't have to be large in numbers to do very powerful and radical things. It's about how we show up and the intention that is brought into that community space and into that community building. And finally, that, you know, these ways that we can remember Karbala, I talk about, you know, Karbala personally as like a lot of people in the context of revolution and, you know, thinking about things on a social political level. But really, there is also a finer lesson here too, that sometimes the most radical and revolutionary acts that we can engage in are these just smaller acts of interpersonal kindness, to extend to one another, to look out for one another, to offer services for one another. Because in a lot of ways, the difficulties that people are experiencing today, maybe at the hands of the state, maybe at the hands of just these normalized value systems, of like the individual has to pick themselves up, you know, from the bootstraps, that it's not really always enough to just like, you know, call this out, but that we recognize that those indignities, they occurred. Basic needs were denied the Prophet's family as well. And so being able to come up and show up in ways to alleviate some of the difficulties that people in our communities might be facing is a way to remember and honor Karbala. So, but yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's recite the salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farjahum. Thank you so much, sister. It was a great, both scholarly and also like touching lecture. Because we are reaching the adhan time, I have a very quick question. There is a sermon of Imam Hussein alayhi salam 3 years before his martyrdom, in the sermon of Mina, for many like the Sahaba and Tabi'ins, and he kind of criticizes the Muawiyah's government, specifically this touches upon social justice and poverty, and also like political. Have you ever like reached on that, or have any reflection on that sermon of Mina or Khutbatul Mina?
I think it's been no. I think I've heard of it, but honestly, it's. I appreciate you sharing that. But inshallah, I'll look into that.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for joining us and accepting our invitation. So please recite the salawat or the salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farjahum. So, okay, we will say goodbye to you at this moment, and we are doing the adhan prayer at this point. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you so much for having me again.
Yeah, thank you.